These days, every job is a technology job. Whether you're a programmer, a marketer, or even just someone who sits down in front of a computer every day, you have a stake in the tapestry of the technology industry. Welcome to WITS and Wisdom, a podcast sharing insights, innovations, and inspiration from the award-winning Women in Tech Summit. Join host Gloria Bell, founder of the Women in Tech Summit, multi-hyphenate entrepreneur, and advocate for equity and equality in tech as she sits down with extraordinary guests from the WITS community. Listen in as they discuss wisdom from their career journeys, pro tips from their areas of expertise, and sneak previews of the biggest upcoming tech trends. This is WITS and Wisdom, a podcast from the Women in Tech Summit and Inspiring Tech Foundation.
Hello, and welcome to WITS and Wisdom, a podcast sharing insights, innovation, and inspiration from the award-winning Women in Tech Summit. I'm your host, Gloria Bell, founder of WITS and the Inspiring Tech Foundation. And just to let you know, we are here live at WITS Mid-Atlantic in Washington, D.C. We've had 2 wonderful days of great speakers, inspiring sessions, and lots of great learning. And you can learn more about our upcoming 2023 sessions and summits at womenintechsummit.com. And I want to give a special shout out so that people are aware, if you've been affected by some of the turmoil in the tech industry lately, we do have free tickets for anyone who has been laid off. Visit Women in Tech Summit and find our ticket assistance program. You can apply there, and we can help you with your networking and keeping your skills current on your new job journey. And today at WITS Mid-Atlantic, we're live with service designer and new author, Lauren Maffeo. Lauren gave our first presentation this morning, and she has been a previous speaker at WITS and has done some really fascinating work. And so we wanted to have her join us today on the podcast to talk about her journey in tech, as well as some of the work that she's done, and about her new book that is coming out. Welcome, Lauren.
Hi, thank you so much for having me.
So I'm going to dive right in. First, you spoke at WITS here in DC 4 years ago, pre-pandemic, before we had to go virtual. So tell us about that journey. When you first spoke at WITS, what were you working on then?
So when I spoke at WITS the first time, I was in a fairly different place in my career. I was working in tech. I was working as a business intelligence research analyst in Gartner's small and mid-sized business unit. And I gave a talk on erasing unconscious bias from your AI data sets. And in some ways, there's a straight line, at least on the surface, between that presentation and what I am doing now, also what I spoke about today, because today I led a talk about how to design data governance standards as part of your data mesh architecture. That is a way of mitigating bias in AI. And I think my takeaway for how I have grown from 4 years ago to now is that I am still in the same space. My company is different. I am now with a federal government contractor called Steampunk, working as a human-centered service designer. And I am integrated onto technical teams now in a way that I wasn't before when I was here 4 years ago. And the biggest change is that I have become a published book author. I just released my first book with the Pragmatic Bookshelf last month. And so that has been a really exciting journey to bring this book into the world and to write it, especially during COVID when I had a lot more time on my hands than I normally do.
I'm excited for you for the book. Because just the title of the book, I can't decide if I'm intimidated by it or am I intrigued by it. And I think it's probably equal amounts of both. The book is Designing Data from the Ground Up. So when did you know you wanted to write a book?
I think the idea was in my head maybe even as early as childhood, because I always enjoyed reading and writing and I always wanted to create something myself. I was always interested in nonfiction, and that's, I think, because I wanted to be a journalist for so long. I always was very interested in feature writing, and I would have loved to be a feature writer for an outlet like NPR or the Washington Post, where I was telling these really in-depth stories of particular people and then contextualizing those stories within broader narratives or problems. And I actually think that is a great parallel to what I do now as a service designer, because what I do is conduct user interviews with particular users, and those individual interviews are not representative of the wider user groups, but they do help lend really important context to the challenges that these user groups face. And so I do see a parallel there. In terms of actually writing a book, it came in a roundabout way because I, in the fall of 2020, was contracted to write a research report for a separate tech publisher. And for various reasons, I got through the entire writing process, including a halfway point. And the person who had sponsored this report chose ultimately to shelve that report, and it never got published. And so I was in this space where I effectively had enough content for a book, even if it was going to be a small book. And so I reached out to a contact of mine at the Pragmatic Programmers, which is a smaller tech publisher of books. And I had met this person at a conference a few months before the pandemic. I reached out with the idea for this book. He was able to connect with their editorial team. They reviewed the pitch and ultimately accepted it. And I'm telling that story because this book was actually born from a pretty big failure in terms of getting contracted to write a report, writing the entire report, only then to have it not see the light of day. And I kept telling myself I won't believe it until it's actually out there in the world. I'm very happy to say it is officially out there in the world. The longer answer is that I think probably in a way I've wanted to do this my whole life, even though I didn't always acknowledge it. And then it started to become a reality 2 years ago. So from the time that I actually pitched my publisher to getting the book out there and available for purchase, that was 2 years.
So it sounds like there was someone's crucial to the book becoming a reality. One, the person who contracted you to write the report, they were kind of step one. Had they not turned down the report, the book might not have happened. And then you said you had a contact at the publisher. Was there anyone else in your world that helped inspire the book, helped you make the book a reality?
I would say my clients did, because I was working as a designer in these environments where there were literally millions of unique data points that these organizations had. They had existed for decades. They had, in some cases, centuries worth of original data that they still stored. And I was very surprised to see the lack of quality standards and governance that was present within these organizations. And this is not singling one client or one department, one agency, any business out. This is actually the norm. That's what I came to realize, is that the vast majority of organizations today have no mechanisms for how to manage and control and disseminate all of the data that they possess. And that's a very long way of saying that my clients inspired the book, because I knew that there were better mechanisms of managing this, especially as a service designer. And I often work with very technical clients who have never heard of human-centered design, and they don't know what a rosebud thorn exercise is or a vision statement. And as technical as they are, as technical as this work is, I do believe that framing it as a design challenge to be solved is a different way of solving this problem, which ultimately is a culture and people challenge rather than purely being technical.
Very interesting. Was there anyone that you were picturing when you thought of your audience for the book?
I was really hoping that people with authority to implement change would be able to read the book, because I think that any large scale transformation, whether it's cultural, technical, or both, has to be top down. If the most senior person in your organization is not bought into it, it's not going to work. They have to bless it, evangelize it, give you the funds that you need to enact change. And so I was really hoping that I would get people who have the authority in their organizations to start building data governance programs. And that is not always a given. And it depending on your organization, that person could be a data scientist, they could be the chief data officer, they could be the CIO. In some cases, that is also consultants. And so in that sense, I think this book is for people in consulting or advisory roles as well. And I also lastly thought of the audience at a Women in Data Science meetup and conference that I spoke at years ago. Many of the women in that audience, they had graduated from data science master's programs. They worked at very well-known companies, so they had great jobs. And when I asked the audience, how many of you learned about data governance in your education, none of them raised their hands. And so these are trained data scientists who have great jobs, they have higher education, and they got no education on how to implement data quality and governance. And so I thought about them too, and I thought about the gap in their education that this book could, I hope, fill.
Very defined audience. I think that's going to be a real key to making your book a success. I think there's a lot of authors that go out and, oh, my book's for everybody. And not every book is for everybody.
It's so interesting you say that, because when I was doing a podcast interview for this book months ago, I actually said, I think if you are going to keep your head on straight during this process, you have to start by saying, my book is not for everyone. Because if it is for everyone, then no one's going to enjoy it or gain anything from it. Did I write my book with my parents in mind? I love them to death, but no. I mean, and I hope they enjoy it, but it's not for everyone. I do hope that anybody who could pick it up could learn something, that it would be written in a way that they can understand it and hopefully gain some knowledge. But I did have a very clear target audience in mind, and I was writing for them. And I think that not only helps you focus your writing, but it also helps you maybe even deal with a little criticism a bit. And criticism, by the way, is different from constructive feedback. And I want to emphasize that, because I have had some folks like software engineers reach out with some advice on how to improve. And whether I implement it or not in future editions of the book, I view that as knowledge sharing. That's very different than saying I hated it, which is not constructive at all. So I do want to emphasize that too, is just because someone gives you feedback on, maybe what was missing or what you could have expanded upon, I don't necessarily view that as a negative until it is non-constructive.
And I think that's hugely important. And I think we miss that sometimes. We hear the negative and we immediately shut down and don't necessarily listen to what's being said. I think it's really important that you're recognizing that some of that feedback that you're getting could be useful for you.
Yes.
Yeah, that's fantastic. So you've done a lot, and I know marketing the book and getting word out about it is a lot of work. But have you thought about what's next? What's next for you as a professional? What's next for you as an author? Is there another book? And what's next for you personally? Are you taking a vacation?
You asked what's the same now versus 4 years ago, but also what's different. And 4 years ago, had just come back from a vacation in Australia within a week of talking at WITS. And then this year, I spoke at WITS within a week of coming back from Jordan. So I did take a international vacation last week, which was very exciting. And I have another actual vacation coming up fairly soon, which I'm very excited for, especially after a very busy winter working full time, along with trying to get the book out and getting the word about the book out. I don't know about another book. I would love to think I have one in me. I think before writing another one, I would probably publish a second edition of this book that is expanded. And I do plan to try to do a listening tour of sorts where I go to speak with data scientists and data stewards and data officers and learn about the aspects of implementing the steps in the book that they find most challenging. I would love to expand on what I've started. And so I would love in the future to publish in a revised or updated edition of the book. In terms of what I'd like to do professionally, I would really love to level up in terms of gaining more seniority and authority to make those decisions that we talked about a little earlier in the podcast. I think for the time being, the book is definitely a huge priority for me, and I realistically don't have much bandwidth to take on a lot else, but that's where my head is at.
It sounds like a really good plan. So, Lauren, it has been wonderful talking with you.
Thank you so much for having me.
So glad that you were able to join us at WITS. So how can our listeners get in touch with you if they want to know more? And more importantly, getting in touch with you is very important, but more importantly, how can they find your book?
Great question. So I am on LinkedIn under my full name, Lauren Maffeo, and I am always happy to connect with folks there. I'm very active on the platform. I would encourage folks to go to pragprog.com, and they can find Designing Data Governance from the Ground Up there in print and e-reader formats. But they can also go to Barnes & Noble, Target, Amazon. All of those major websites have copies of the book, and so you can also order it there if you prefer print copies, or in some cases like Amazon, digital copies as well.
Awesome. That's great. And I would encourage everybody, if you want to know a little bit more about ways to better manage your data, this is a great place to learn about some ways to do that. Is there anything else, anywhere you're going to be speaking, anything else that you've got coming up that you want to let our listeners know about?
Yes, so I am going to be speaking at a few events, especially in May. I will be at the Open Source Summit North America in Vancouver from May 10th to 12th, and I will speak at Open Source North in St. Paul, Minnesota on May 24th. So I will be there discussing the same topic. I will also be hosting a Birds of a Feather session at Open Source Summit, talking to people who are doing this data governance, data mesh work, to chat through the challenges they're facing with it, what's working well, trying to create a community of practice to get more feedback on where there are roadblocks in this process. And so if anybody will be at Open Source Summit North America in Vancouver and you want to come to that session on May 11th, I would love to see you there.
Awesome. Yeah, come chat with Lauren if you get a chance. So I want to thank you again, Lauren, for joining us. I want to thank all of our listeners for listening in and joining us. And I encourage you to go to womenintechsummit.com, take a look at the rest of our 2023 schedule. You can join us at one of our upcoming summits in Chicago, our virtual summit in July, or you can join us in Denver or in Raleigh. Thank you again for listening to Wits and Wisdom, and we'll see you next time.
Ready to learn more about the Women in Tech Summit? Visit our website at womenintechsummit.net. That's womenintechsummit.net to view our most up-to-date event schedules, calls for speakers, and sponsorship opportunities. If you enjoyed this episode, bookmark the show, give us a follow, or leave a review on Apple Podcasts. It helps us educate, inspire, and connect with even more movers and shakers within and beyond the technology industry. Thanks for listening, and see you here again soon on Wits and Wisdom, a podcast from the Women in Tech Summit and the Inspiring Tech Foundation.